You're listening to America's Most Challenging Issue, where BahaiTeachings.org interviews community builders across the nation who are inspired by the Baha'i vision of the oneness of humankind. Join us as we explore their work, bringing about racial unity and establishing a more just and equitable society. I'm your host, Masood Olufani. Social activist, architect, vocalist, choral arranger, conductor, composer, father, grandfather, practical joker, Baha'i. Just a few of the titles that describe the rich and varied life of Van Gilmer. In a prolific musical career that has taken him from the segregated South of the 1960s to Russia, India, China, Europe, Washington, D.C., and Carnegie Hall, Van has consistently sought to use his art form as a creative tool to dismantle the barriers that separate us. A committed Baha'i since 1964, he has consistently explored creative ways to extend the reach of the principle of the oneness of mankind, both in his 37-year career as an architectural engineer and as a world-renowned vocalist and choral conductor. In this episode of America's Most Challenging Issue, we unpack the life and career of Mr. Van Gilmer, paying particular attention to how his experiences with racism, both as a child in Greensboro, North Carolina, and his subsequent travels, help frame his activism and how the Baha'i teachings inform his understanding of the concept of unity through diversity. Van, welcome to America's Most Challenging Issue.
Thank you, Masood. It's good to be here.
Wonderful to have you. You know, I've always known you as a choir director, first of the Baha'i Gospel Choir, and now in your current position as the musical director at the Baha'i National Center in Wilmette, Illinois. But what I didn't know was the journey that led you to the work you are now doing. And that journey begins in a segregated community in Greensboro, North Carolina. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what that experience was like and how music first entered your life.
Well, I almost can't remember a time that I wasn't in some way connected with music, either singing it, playing it, or learning to play on some new instrument. So from very early age, there was music in my home. There was a piano. We were just blessed to be able to have an instrument, a large piano. It had a great sound, and my grandmother was just intent on my learning to play it. So I, like many other young boys and girls, took piano lessons, and I took it for quite a while. And then I went on, and the singing became the forefront of any of the music presentations that I made.
What was it like growing up in the segregated South during that time? What was that experience like? You were born and raised in a predominantly Black community during a time of segregation. Did you find that experience nurtured you? Was it a hindrance to your development? How did it impact you growing up?
It wasn't something I initially thought about at all, because the community was so loving. We knew everybody, even if we were across town from each other, we met each other. My life was really restricted to those Black neighborhoods of Greensboro, North Carolina. And we had actually no need to go anywhere else because all the stores we went to were there. And if we wanted to do anything big, we'd have to go downtown. But we carefully chose where we would go by the way people either looked at us or treated us. When we had to go out of the Black community. And everybody who was white knew that if they saw you, you were there because you had to get something. You weren't there to intrude. You weren't there to linger around. You were going to get what you had to get and move out. And so it was really a beautiful childhood as I think about it. My teachers, hard now to think about this, though. My teachers were African American. My teachers knew my parents. The community supported one another. It had different strata of society within the Black community. But we had a wonderful life, and really not, for me, not yearning for anything else. Because I thought that the way we were living was the way it was supposed to be. It took me a while. It took me to college. It took me to high school, college before I started really thinking about this separation. Why the separation? Well, so why can't we go places that others can go? Now I'm becoming more and more independent, getting ready to live my life. And I'm seeing these restrictions are really in the way. And so that's what I think most of us came to as we entered college. And it may have been some of the last years of high school that we knew that there was an obvious difference. And the way we knew that difference would generally be the Christmas parade. Christmas parade, all the bands would be downtown from the high schools, and there was only one Black high school that serviced all the Black people of Greensboro. It was Dundee High School. And we were so proud, in our uniforms, but we were all Black. And that's when it was a shocking difference. When this Black band came through, there was kind of a different march. There was a different beat. There was screaming and whistling from our friends and relatives. And it became something that I think we all began to wonder about as we knew that we could not go to those schools. This was, of course, at a time when Black people didn't go anywhere that was really a place that we would normally go now. If I went to the movie, I always went to the back door, went up the stairs all the way to the top, sat in the balcony and looked down on the white people in the movie. It was just standard. So this evolution of beginning to think about being Black in a world that is mostly white in America and in Greensboro, and it sank in. It sank in as a couple of friends of mine with two other guys went downtown and started the sit-ins in Greensboro, North Carolina. I was a senior in high school. They were freshmen in college. And so
Wow.
we all knew each other. And we couldn't believe somebody stepped out of the boundary. And I think that awakened the community very slowly. And when I say community, the entire United States community. First Greensboro, then it became national, all of the cities. There was bus protests going on in Montgomery, and we knew about that. And of course, there had been killings and other things, and we knew about that. But those were remote, and though we were saddened by it, we weren't yet personally affected because we hadn't just gotten to a place where we said, no, this is not the way we can continue. This is not the way I can grow up. Though my parents did, and though their parents did, we now were beginning to have the freedom to be able to step out.
It's so interesting. You talk about being nurtured as a child in this predominantly Black environment, and in a way being protected, I suppose, right, from some of those virulent forms and expressions of racism. So it's kind of like an insular experience, and then as you get to college, you begin to have an awakening to that notion of difference. Now, I know in 1964, according to you, you became a Baha'i, and I'm very interested, and I think our listeners might be interested in how you heard about the faith and what finally led you to embrace the teachings of Baha'u'llah.
Well, becoming a Baha'i was not anything I imagined I would do, not anything I was looking for, but as I said, in 1960 were the sit-ins. I had become very involved with the sit-ins, but there was a resurgence of the sit-ins in Greensboro and in the country in 1963. And in 1963, I was one of hundreds of people jailed because we stood in front of theaters that we couldn't go in. We stood in front of restaurants that we couldn't go in. We went to places like McDonald's and we try to buy a hamburger. And I couldn't believe now, I had not even had a hamburger from McDonald's, and I'm in college. I mean, anyway. So this is 1963, and just by chance, I ran into a person who was bold enough to invite me to come to a Baha'i meeting. Now, I knew he was a Baha'i. I didn't know what that was. I knew that the home that he was rooming in, that the lady was a Baha'i. I knew that, and I had known that for a long time, but I didn't know what Baha'i meant. But in these sit-ins, when we're just every day, every thought is about blacks and whites coming together. How can we open the doors and the gates that have been closed for so long? And here I run into these Baha'is now who had asked me to sing at a function at the University of North Carolina, A&T, State University. And I went there, and there were just a couple of people. I didn't know that everybody in the room was Baha'i except me. But that group was mixed. There was a black female who was a student. There was a Persian, Iranian man who was an instructor. And there were two white people who came from the next city. So it was World Religion Day. And I was there to sing my song. I went with my music in my hand because I was going to play the piano and sing my song. Unfortunately, the guy who invited me didn't tell them he had invited me to come and sing. So I ended up just listening to the program. And in the process, liking the things I heard, wondering about who these people really are, because they were now black and white. And they were even odd on the campus of North Carolina A&T because there were no white people there. I mean, whatever people were there were professors, and it was just a couple of those, not many. So a white person stood out on the campus. Well, I left there, and I would not have investigated any further. But the Baha'is invited me to come back after they found out I was supposed to have sung. And they wanted to make amends. And well, that's what they said. And they invited me to come and sing again, to sing for the first time. But now it was in the home of a white couple who lived just at the edge of Greensboro. But obviously a place I would not go by myself. So I got a friend to go with me. And he was a student. Both of us were sophomores. We were sophomores at A&T. And we went to this home. These people were just loving, wonderful, really, and different for us because we hadn't really been around white people who were just friendly unless they were selling us something, you know. They would do what they had to do to sell us things, but that was about it. And so we talked about the Baha'i faith. I heard the principles, oneness of humanity, all religions are one, equality of men and women. And I got to thinking, wow, I believe all these things. I mean, I always have believed those things. But what I saw was that little community, that little Baha'i community in Greensboro was really a small model of what the world could be one day. And so I joined, and when I met the Baha'is, they were mostly white women. older white women, gray hair, puffed up on their heads, and some very proper. And I can imagine what do they see in me? What is this about? What is this religion about? And it obviously convinced me they cared for me as a person, an individual, a human being. And so after we had that first time with the Baha'is, if they invited us to come to anything else, we started going. And then we started asking when the next meeting. And then we were regular. And no more than 9 months passed before I decided this is what I'll try. Now this meant for me leaving the Baptist Church, Southern Baptist Church, great singing, music. The person on the organ would make the organ talk and scream, and people would get up and shout, and it was an unbelievable experience that so many people have not had who are not Black. And here I was now going to leave that and go to something a whole lot more prim and proper, not in a big church, but in a home. And I'm thinking, is this going to work? And then I was one of the only Black people in that community. So it had to be a test for me to make that change then. But it was, I figured, I can try it. If it doesn't work, I'll just leave it. Well, I never left. Because the principles are so right for this time. And many years sung about loving one another. Many years talking about our coming together, but it was in the Black church. And I loved that. I hadn't thought about the example of it. So here was the spiritual word, the true word really coming even through the minister to the audience, to the congregation. And we talk about we loved and we would hold hands and we would sing and we would hug. But missing from that was any person white, any person who was different from us. So, when you start thinking about those things, you say, maybe I will make the change. Now, we were a rare few who made the change at the time, but it was a change, I think, for the better, because as I came up in life, as they say, I was able to deal a little better with the first colleagues who were white, who didn't know anything about being around Black people.
Yeah, let's talk about that for a bit. I wanted to a couple of things that you pointed to that I think is very, very interesting. How, in some sense, the church prepared you for the example, right?
Yes.
The manifestation of the word in flesh, made flesh, right, through example.
Yes.
So you got that inspiration from the church about this notion of oneness, but you didn't see it made flesh in the context of the church. And then you come to the Baha'i community and you see it made flesh. So in many ways, this notion of you building on that knowledge that you had previously acquired, but then seeing the dynamic of the example, which confirms your faith in Baha'u'llah.
What we said way back then is true today, though. When Friday, Saturday, and Sunday come along, those Sabbath days, everybody in their places of worship are just alike. And it becomes one of the most segregated. Back then, we said the most segregated hour was the church hour.
Yeah.
And today, it still is.
Absolutely.
Because we pretty much are, however we grew up, that's where we remained.
Absolutely.
And crossing over to something else is a harder thing to do.
Absolutely.
And I think it's a part of the human development, where all the people and the things around us teach us one thing. We begin to love it. We do it. That's how racism is so deep. We were taught by our parents, our grandparents. They didn't teach me to hate white people. They taught me to love other people.
Man, this is wonderful. I'm thinking about your college years. Now, you attended North Carolina A&T, where you studied architectural engineering. And after graduating, you secured a job in the civil service branch of the Navy, where you were the only Black engineer among an office of how many was it?
There were 30 people.
Wow.
30 people.
Wow. And I'm thinking about, as you fairly knew Baha'i at that point, right?
Yes.
And seeing this example of the oneness of mankind expressed quite literally in the context of the Baha'i community. I'm wondering how you were able to manage successfully to navigate your way through that experience of being the only person of African descent within the context of your professional work environment.
I suspect that I was like every Black student who graduated from college and went to work and had to now assimilate. It may have been shocking for some, even more shocking for others, but I also had become Baha'i. So I became just a little easy feeling around white people, trying to think as equal, but learning every other 2 weeks or so when somebody said the N-word and didn't know I was around and apologized. It was so hurtful to think this person is supposed to be my friend, because people acted like, they were acting friendly. But also when you think about how you can make it in an organization, what do you have to do to make it in an organization? An organization that's already set up, not thinking about there will one day come African Americans to fill jobs like engineering jobs and scientist jobs and teaching outside of their communities. So it wasn't as difficult for me as I think it may have been for some who had not started to make that transition before going to college. College was the first time, coming out of college, the very first time I had any interaction with white people was at work. Now, that's not true for the young white guys who had come in, engineers who had come in. They knew people, they knew each other, they knew a friend of another. They didn't find it unusual for that group to be all white. That's like today. You don't see your group as all white. I'm saying I love everybody, but my group is a different group. I am isolated in my group. So coming up through the federal government meant that I, like every African American who came up the ladder in professional jobs, had to act my way through. There would be times I would say, I'm just not going to take this, but I took it. There were times when I would see people chosen for positions and projects and wonder, why wasn't me? Why wasn't it me? And then you had to be strong enough to even be able to ask that question in an all-white environment, in one that you're not familiar with, in one that you think that things could happen to you. So I think, like every other African American during that time, and even now, if they find themselves coming from a Black community or a white community together, excuse me, for instance, in the area that I live in, it's a highly segregated area. People are nice, but mostly white, mostly wealthy or middle to upper class people live in the neighborhood. in the neighborhoods. And really, the people don't see anybody of color. Not in today, they don't see anybody of color. And of course, they surely know Black people exist now because Black people have moved their way through many jobs that were not traditionally jobs that they would hold. And so you have to be aware that we are somewhere, African Americans are somewhere, but they may not be anywhere near. And here in the area where I live, I think most people, when they see a Black person, way down in them and say, "Oh, that's a Black person." You wouldn't have to do that if we were just regularly there and there all the time.
Yeah, it's wonderful. I'm thinking of as you're talking about some of the things you endured during your professional career as an architectural engineer. I'm thinking about Du Bois talking about that kind of double consciousness. We wear the mask, right? Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, and how we have to maneuver through these spaces where racism is so deeply entrenched. And I'm also thinking that that the Baha'i community must have served in some sense as a buttress for you, as a way to help you navigate those spaces and have a counterexample, right, of communities coming together, however tentatively, however challenged as that will be sometime, but nevertheless taking determined steps. Conscious, intentional steps to come together and to live out the teachings of the Baha'i faith with the oneness of mankind being the core principle. So did you find that was true for you? The Baha'i faith served as a kind of counterbalance to what you were experiencing in the professional environment?
Yes, it did very much. In fact, I think it helped prepare me for moving upward and forward in the Navy Department. I think there was when I say in the beginning, I thought people said, "Oh, okay, here's a Black person," but later it was, but this Black person is not like all the other Black people, I like Van, but I'm not sure if I like everybody who's Black, but I do like Van. And so they almost could see me as not being African American, though it's obvious that I am. And I think those moments were the moments that opened the door here and there to move on and to move up and to move. So and I say too that there are many Black people who have had the opportunity to say, I was the only Black person to do this. In my life, there's just so many things that I was the first Black person to do this. The first Black person to do things like live in a complex of housing that was all white. I was the first Black person to move in. I couldn't believe I was the first. But the manager told me that because she wanted me to know that there could be problems. And this was just outside of Washington, D.C. And so, though I would get these little warnings here and there, you just keep going. You just keep, you keep trying to hold your head up high. But I think it does take its toll if you don't find a community like the Baha'i community, a community that is obviously accepting, which is your refuge. I can have a really bad day and go to a Baha'i meeting in the evening and say, wow, I can't believe the distinct differences of these communities.
Wow.
Hopefully that's not the same now. Hopefully it's getting better.
Yeah. You talked about some of those first, right? You being in these positions where you're the first. And I wanted to explore, another first for you. And that was after you retired from the Navy, you began this second career as a choir conductor. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, I've been a Baha'i since 1992, which was a very special time for the Baha'i world community because it was the fruit of the Holy Year. the 100th anniversary of the passing or the ascension of the prophet founder of the faith,
I'm
Baha'u'llah.
sure you're just telling me that to make me feel old.
Never that, brother. Never that. 1992. Yes. I'm just a baby, but
You are.
I know. But I'm thinking about that time because that was the first time during the Baha'i World Convention in New York City in 1992 that we actually featured gospel music as an integral part of the Baha'i worship experience of the Baha'i world community. And you were selected to be the choir director of the Baha'i Gospel Choir. And I wanted to, if you wouldn't mind just explaining to our listeners just briefly about how you came to that position, how that developed, how you were chosen, and what it was like to be chosen to fulfill that function.
Well, it was a wonderful experience, and it was a very scary experience because it was to introduce music from the Americans of African descent in front of thousands and thousands of Baha'is from all over the world who may not have been familiar with the music in their faith, but music that they might have heard if they had Black churches in their areas in America. So we were introducing gospel music, African American gospel music in the Baha'i faith as directed and requested by the Universal House of Justice, the international governing body of Baha'is of the United States, of the world. And so just thinking about how we would do that, because we had no music. I left in my Baptist church, good music, woo! Now, when I came to the Baha'i faith, I calmed down to a guitar and a little folk song and beautiful music, but different music. And it was the standard. You'd see Baha'is with their guitars. In that day, it was almost like the hippies, because who would have a guitar? Anyway, I learned to play a guitar in order to be able to sing in the Baha'i community. Then I also participated in the choir in college. So I had a musical training further as an elective. And then I took organ lessons in college, which unheard of them. Well, architectural engineering student taking organ lessons in the music department or being in the choir. I would have to get permission to go on choir tour because I would be missing classes. I never thought that might lead to where I am now. So I sang, became known a bit in the Baha'i community as a singer. And I sang with a group, an international group called the Voices of Baha. And we went around the world singing, and I was a soloist with that group. And the gospel music began right when all of this was happening as well. And so we had to find music that would be in the style of the gospel music I was familiar with in the African American church. Now, I wasn't a singer in the gospel choir in my own Black church. We had so much better people singing. But I loved that music, and I always had it here. Had it in me. It makes my bones vibrate. And so when I was asked to be the director of the gospel choir, this first gospel choir, I said no. I can't do that. That's not something I can do. You need to find somebody else who has had that experience. I said, now I know what is good gospel music, but I don't know that I could direct a choir with just gospel music. So I said to the person who was Tom Price a great musician also who has had choirs all over the world for the Baha'i faith. He asked me, and I said to him, why don't you look around? I'm sure there's some African American who comes right out of the church with all this training that could do a gospel choir. And at the time, he couldn't find anybody. He didn't even know anybody who would do it. And he called me back and said, you're going to have to do it. So I said, okay. And so we then immediately started writing music, and not just writing it down, but just making music that would sound like music we knew. And this was over just a couple of months. The first word about a gospel choir came in late August of 1962. In the 1992, I'm sorry. And then we had no music, so we started asking people, can you send some songs to me, see if we can compile something, because they wanted us to do a concert, and they also wanted us to sing before this 30,000 people who were coming from around the world. So I was reviewing music. People were sending me stuff on tapes. At the time, cassette tapes, and we would listen to the music, and we were trying to figure out what can we do. And that was September. By October, we had identified people around the country who might sing in that choir. November was when we were to do it. And we only came together 2 days before we were to sing. So
unbelievable.
A lot of pressure.
Yeah. Unbelievable.
In the 2 days we were there in New York, singing the music and planning the music and rehearsing the music, I contracted, oh God. Anyway, it was from nerves, and I didn't know that, but I went to a doctor, and he looked at my back. He said, "Oh." So I was sick and then not sick.
Wow.
The music was uplifting. The experience was great. And the reaction to the music of the 30,000 people blew us away.
It's extraordinary.
We were afraid that they were going to hear it and say, oh, they're making fun of our faith, because the music was unlike any of the music we'd heard.
It was extraordinary. It was absolutely extraordinary. And I'm fortunate that I saw the videotape of that experience of the gospel choir singing, and it was really inspired me to eventually embrace the Baha'i teaching. I want to turn our attention to another dimension of the Baha'i faith, which focuses on work performed with the spirit of service being regarded as an act of worship, right? Now, we know that the present line of action of the Baha'i World Community involves the strengthening of communities through study of the sacred writings and community service, which is a kind of like a systematic effort to break down the barriers that divide us. And we call this systematic effort the core activities. And I'm interested to find out what function does music fulfill for you in this process? And how do you see music as helping to break down those entrenched divisions that historically have separated Black from white, Latino from Asian, and so forth and so on, that have kept us separate? How can music help to break down those barriers?
About 8 years ago, I began hosting a devotional in my home. I called it a devotional infused with music. It started with just a couple of people. And then it grew. Sometimes it was 35, and then might be 12 the next time. So I never knew how many people would come, but we always try to sing a song or two, and then say some prayers or read some poetry or something that inspired us, and always had a theme for the for the evening.
And that devotional is one component of those core activities, right? Along with children's classes, study, devotional gatherings as well. Yeah.
And of course, the choir, being the choir director here at the House of Worship for the North American continent, I'm always involved in music, and the music is there for the devotions, which are weekly. And so there's a choir that sings there, and the choir sings from up above where you can't see them. The dome of the Baha'i House of Worship is 17 stories tall. So we're midway up. You just hear this music. Many people think it might be a recording, but the music soothes the spirit and the soul of man. And then when you add some of the sacred writings, you have that powerful feeling that one gets in any spiritual setting when there's both sacred word and writing, sacred writings. So in the House of Worship, there's only the sacred writings from any of the world's religions, and the music has to be based on the writings of any of those religions, those main religions of the world. So without having a formal group doing something specific like a devotional here in my home, we're also doing the music for the House of Worship, and there has not ever been regular music at the Baha'i House of Worship. So we're providing the music there. Some people now call to see if the choir is singing because they want to come when the choir is singing.
That's wonderful. That is wonderful.
The music, and I think the shocking thing about the music has been, I have been able, and this is where I think I must have landed in this job, because I couldn't figure it out. My major was architectural engineering. I mean, I've been involved in music all my life, but why not a music major here to be the choral director? Black man, wow. You really think I could do this? And this is at my retirement time. Excuse me. I'm thinking this, and so I said, no, I won't come. You look around. I'll try. Excuse me. I'll try to help out. And I was for a while coming here once a month, flying in once a month, doing a choir, going back to Maryland, where I was now residing. Now, so in the core activities are these devotionals. These are personal devotionals in homes. As we think about it, and we think about our condition here and our situation here, we're not only having them in our homes, we're providing also the music for the public and others at the House of Worship. And the music is a vital part of it. Sometimes they're down waiting for the choir to come down so they can see who these people are and to say, oh, the music. And of course, we think about the words that are going to be read and what music might be appropriate with those words that are going to be read. The other thing is that the choir is open to anybody who would like to sing. So it has, in this past few years, started attracting other people who hadn't thought of music, particularly music in the Baha'i House of Worship, but who have been inspired by the music of the choir. So that was a given to me. I have no idea that this was going to happen.
Wow.
It's a wonderful thing that also has attracted people.
Well, Van, you are in your 7th decade, brother. And, you've had... I'm sorry, I didn't mean to remind you that, but you wared well, brother. You wared well. You've led this, this eventful life. You've grew up in segregated Greensboro, Greensboro, North Carolina. You've also moved through a successful career as an architectural engineer and now into the position that you hold at the Baha'i National Center. And I'm just wondering, as you look ahead, given all the experiences you've had, all the learnings that you've kind of integrated into your being, what are your hopes for the future, as it relates to the issue of race and learning to, create this community of true brotherhood and sisterhood that really embodies this ideal of unity through diversity that Baha'i writings speaks so eloquently about? What are your hopes for the future?
Mm-hmm. We have always had this word from God that we should be as one. Somehow, mankind hasn't been able to make that happen. And so God has always sent his messengers 500 to 1,000 years apart, saying to us, hey, I told you before. So here's for today. You need to come together. Love me that I may love thee. One of the words that it can be personal. It can be us and God. I am shocked in many ways that after these 50 some years working in the area of race and music, and that we have to talk about this again. But now I think my hope is that the talking will become action. And the only way talking can become action is that we step out of the little cubicle we're in and reach out to people who are different from us and get to know who they are. And if we don't do that, then we'll always think we're one family without ever having come together. And so my hope is that this is going to speed up. I think maybe in these recent years when there's been this growing concern about killing black men, young and old black men, incarcerating black people for life and filling our jails with them, that we need to think about what do we do to stop that. And we can turn to God, but we've got to do what God says. And that's the thing that I think I'm pushing more than anything else now. Don't just read me that quotation. Show me how you can make that quotation come alive.
Thank you so much, man. I tell you, this has been such a wonderful experience, taking this time to be able to sit down and speak with you. And I just want to thank you for the gift of being you and for sharing your story. And I know there are many people out there who will be inspired by what you've shared, as I have been today. You've been listening to America's Most Challenging Issue. Thanks for joining us. I'm your host, Masood Olufani. And remember, racism retards the unfoldment of the boundless potentialities of its victims, corrupts its perpetuators, and blights human progress. From the Baha'i Writings. Until next time,